So yeah, I suppose the podcast has gone well, better than we expected, I suppose. But what's been really interesting to us is that we get listeners coming in from all over the place, and what we're starting to really discover is construction problems are very much an international set of problems. They don't really change that much, which is really, really interesting. Code changes, which is, your world, absolutely. You get differences in code and differences, but the actual core problems of the business, a lot of the times, are very, very similar and travel, which is great.
Yeah, even the code changes itself, even though the codes may be different, it's still employers and companies struggling to keep up with the regulatory changes. It's a battle. It's a battle for a lot of folks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Tell us about you. Like, what's your background? How did you end up in construction?
My dad was an insulator. So maybe there was a little bit there in the family. I was just kind of curious about what he did, but he got, I know electrocuted is a term for death by electricity, but he got, I guess shocked is kind of an under statement, because he got shocked, but he'd actually died. Luckily, he was working in the hospital and they were able to revive him. So his heart had stopped and all that, but because he was working in a hospital when he got shocked, he was able to be revived. So when I was older, probably middle school and high school, where I probably would have been more interested in what he was doing and maybe wanted to go to a job or something like that. I didn't get to see that, so I know my dad worked with tools and that type of stuff, but I didn't really get it. I wouldn't say it was a heavy influence, even though it was to some degree what my dad did. But I think I liked construction more. I liked the opportunity to be outside. I liked the ever-changing atmosphere.
Yeah.
I think if you look at what I do, my business is kind of a mix of, podcast, website, social media, just this kind of thing that I do for enjoyment. And then there's the part of the business that makes money, which is the code consulting, education for construction companies. I was doing a little bit of permitting and occupancy stuff, but I got out of that world. And now, for the first time, I don't even say it to most people, but we now have one client that I'm doing marketing for. So I like to be in a lot of areas, and I think construction was a good place for that. So that's kind of how I got into it, or why I got into it.
And you went into the consulting world. What I always bring this back to problem. What problem are you solving for construction companies that you take on as your clients?
Sure. So both the consulting and the education were two things that were problems. So I was a building official in Boston. I don't know what you guys have for a term for a building inspector. I know there's some different terms with like quantity surveying and things that we don't have here that you have there. I got to dabble in that. I spent a semester in Reading at their construction management program in Reading, England. And I got acquainted with quantity surveying, but you ask anybody in the construction business over here, it's 90% of them won't know what it is. But sorry, to answer your question, I got off track there, is there was a new regulation that came into place requiring what a lot of people will call NFPA 241 plans, which are construction fire safety plans. So contractors were now going to get permits and were not able to get permits because they didn't have a fire safety plan. I had done a lot of research on it. I wrote about it. I was working for a trade association. We started to do education about it. And I had a lot of folks reaching out saying, hey, can you help me with this? So there was your problem, right? It was a regulatory one. And then the same thing where folks were reaching out, they were having trouble getting a permit or having trouble getting occupancy. So those are a lot of pain points locally, and a lot of that is regulatory, bureaucratic stuff. And then I don't know if you want to start this formally, but
Yeah, no, we're rolling. We're
we're
rolling
rolling.
here,
Okay.
so we'll just
Okay.
roll away. Well, there's no structure here. I mean, to
Great.
talk to you then, because you touched on the podcast, because it's gone quite well for you, the podcast.
Yeah.
What was the idea behind that? Was it like a passion project, or is it something that you just thought could market the business? What was the idea there?
No, absolutely a passion project. I was a podcast junkie, and I was searching for a podcast that was in the construction space where I could learn. I felt like I learned so much about marketing and business and health. Um, a lot of dietary stuff that I changed and was able to have a lot of success. So I wanted the same kind of success on the construction side of things. I wanted to learn about the new things that were happening, whether it was mass timber or codes or temporary sprinklers on construction site. There's so much happening with technology and innovation that I wanted to hear about. And the one thing I also felt, and I don't know where we talked about some things are universal, in construction, I always felt like you learned your piece of the business, right? You were it's an overused term, but you were in a silo, and the silo could be the job. You get put out on a job for a year and a half or 2 years, and that's all you see. Or it could be a role, like you're an estimator and all you see is estimating, but you don't really know what happens out in the field. Or you're out in the field all the time, you don't know what goes to putting a contract together. So those two things, I said, I would love to learn that stuff, and I couldn't find it. It wasn't out there. I don't know about Ireland and the other parts of the country that are listening, but the residential market here in the US gets a lot of attention, right? There's programs locally like This Old House, and there's Modern Craftsman and Essential Craftsman and HGTV and all these home renovations. And there's really nice websites and magazines and podcasts you can listen to. But when it comes to the commercial contractor, there was nothing out there for them. There was this construction tech podcast, but it was just construction tech, right? And that's why I kind of like what you're doing as well, where you're not just talking about construction technology or one particular thing. You're really you're keeping it broad, which I think is interesting. So the goal was that it wasn't out there, and I said, you know what, I'm going to make this, and I'm going to make it for what I would want to listen to. It was very selfish, right? What do I want to hear? What do I want to learn about? And then I got lucky because now I was bringing in these people that I was just thrilled to be able to choose what questions to ask them. CEOs of billion-dollar companies. I mean, I see you had Jamie Heslip on there, right? Or Heslip. As much as an American can be into rugby, I'm into rugby. It stops at Six Nations.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can't really get the coverage here locally, but you can go to a bar, which will tend to be early in the morning, U.S. time. And I would love to just get like a full Irish breakfast and watch Six Nations. So
it's so interesting, because I mean, one of the biggest learning curves for me from doing this, and for me, it was very, very similar, to be honest, Joe. I looked at construction, and I love podcasts too, and I was like, okay, if I want to set off my own construction business world, what's the first thing I would do? I would listen to a podcast about a certain subject. I'd educate myself on that, and it was really, really similar. But our thinking behind this, when we sat down and said, okay, should we do this? Should we not? Okay, let's do it. Was let's try and cover all the different areas of the business that we need to know about. So one of the biggest learnings for me personally, when I went from tradesman into construction business owner, was how harsh a lesson I got taught about not understanding marketing, branding, contracts, finance, mindset, all the different pieces of running a business that you need to know. So for us, it was a bit like, let's just spread it out. And the idea actually with Jamie Heaslip was, he's a well-renowned, respected athlete and captain of Ireland's rugby team, and also went on to play for the British and Irish Lions, and very successful in his own right. But a lot of it was just what mindset he applies to sport that we can now apply that to businesses. He's also become an investor, so that's been really interesting. One of the biggest learnings for me has actually been sitting with people like yourself, like Jamie, like other great construction people we've had on, and the learning that I've taken away, saying, Jesus, like, you know, I get to ask the questions, but I also get to take away the knowledge. Is there anyone that you've had on that sort of stands out to you at the moment?
You know, it wouldn't be from necessarily a big name perspective, but just, you know, there was a guy I had on that was a real estate analyst, but what he would do he would look at like demographics, and this was a new term that I had learned that I'd never even known, and that's where this is so awesome, right? Which is psychographics. And they would, because we would talk, going back to that theory of like, so much happens on a construction site, but you only knew your piece, right? I often felt like I got handed a set of drawings and said, go build this building, right? But what went into choosing that piece of land? How did you get a permit? Why are you building an office here and not an apartment here? You know, this, you know, how did the GMP go together? How did that work, right? There was so much to learn. So with that mindset, you know, I had brought someone on that, and I said, you know, we all go build buildings, but how do they decide what goes there? And that's what this guy does. He does the analysis of, you know, basic things that we might do when we buy a home, which is getting comparable sales, how much per square foot should we pay? But he gets into, okay, if you build a building here, and let's say it's residential, what does the person look like that's going to live there? You know, and they might say it's the three different types of people. One's going to be a male between 28 and 45, likes barstool sports, eats out 3 times a week, would probably eat at the local or farm to table restaurant, wears this type of clothes. And they had what they called avatars for all the different types of people. And that would really inform how a mixed use building would go together. You know, do you need 1 bedrooms or more 3 bedrooms? Do you need a parking space, or are they people that bike or take Uber? What type of restaurant should go in there? What type of store? Do you need a gaming room because there's gamers? Do you need more bike racks? Do you need dog washing because the type of people that are going to live there need So like, I thought he was great. He was an early guest. His name was Andrew Starr. So he really stood out. Another guy that was super interesting and a little outside of the commercial space, a gentleman, the Essential Craftsman. He was a home builder. I believe he's in his 60s, and he's a full-time YouTuber now.
Okay.
Talking about construction, and extremely successful. I mean, at the time he had over 500,000 subscribers on YouTube.
Wow.
And people loved him, but talking with him, it was like talking philosophy. Although we were talking about construction, it was a lot about what you were saying, which was, you know, what's your mindset? And he was so well read and was able to talk about, you know, the beginning of kind of planning within construction, and the people that in California after post-World War II were able to build homes in a very kind of, they weren't pre-manufactured, but very organized way. There would be somebody that would go through and lay out through the slabs. The next crew would do the layout. The next people would stand up the walls, and they made like more of a production mentality out of homes, which hadn't happened. So he was able to tie that to where we are today. And he had some interesting thoughts on risk in construction from a very philosophical standpoint. So, you know, they were great. But to tie back to, you know, it's wonderful for you and I to talk about and get all geeked out on the fact that, hey, this is exciting. We get to talk to these people and ask them the questions and learn. But where does that help your business? I think just by discussing topics that people that you might do business with enjoy, that's a benefit, right? I think you have to talk very little, and it seems like you talk very little about what live cost does, right? Yeah. And I think that's the right recipe. Social media has done very well for my business. I'm 2.5 years in, and I haven't asked for one job yet. which I, you know, almost entirely attribute to social media, the podcast.
And I think it's a good strategy. I really do. I think if you're going to if you're going to really set out a stall to provide value to people, like, don't provide value first and then look for something back in return. So I mean, we're purposely driven by let's just provide the value. You know, if people are interested in finding out what we do on the back end and coming back to us at a later date, fine, no worries, we'll talk about that. But like, if we are setting out a stall as let's provide value for construction business owners and people in the industry, well, let's just do that. And let's not sit on the back of that and say, oh, by the way, we have this shiny software over here. Why don't you come and talk to us about that? It's difficult to get into conversations without going into that, the COVID world. I suppose, what is the current situation there? How are you, what is what's the construction situation like at the moment?
Yeah, jobs are opening back up, or I would say we're almost back to full steam. It's a different world, which I'm sure it's there with just face masks and required hand washing stations, checking employees in as they show up to do COVID screenings, in some cases temperature checks, in a lot of cases temperature checks. So that has, it's just really kind of a new way of doing business at this point. In speaking with some municipalities, the way that they're trying to operate remotely, they're kind of looking at it like, okay, we're going to have to look at this for the long haul, right? Whereas the initial response was, okay, let's put a Band-Aid on this and just try and get things working remotely as best we can, hoping that we'll get back to normal. Now they're looking at it much more like, okay, how do we start putting some permanent processes in place in case this does take a year or a year and a half or 2 years, right? And I think some of the folks that you've had on talked a little bit about this, where something that's unfortunate kind of pushes people to change that they kind of always knew they needed to make, right? The building departments should not be taking paper plans anymore, right? They should be electronic plans. It's kind of silly that we're doing this whole charade, but could never really make it happen. So this has kind of forced a lot of people's hands. And I think that's a good thing. It forced my hands in some way to change the way I do business, right? And some of it is going to work and some of it isn't, but I think it's been a great push. I think we're pretty much back to full capacity from job sites, and no more job sites are shut down, really. But it's just in a modified sense, right?
Do you remember when you first thought this could be a real problem? Do you think back to, was there a time, or was it something that gradually started chipping away at you, or do you remember?
Yeah, I do. And I remember because I was sharing the information kind of as it happened, and the response I was getting from folks and questions that came in just when press conferences, because what happened here in Massachusetts was, there was federal regulations, but then there was state regulations here in Massachusetts. But then what happened was local mayors and town managers deviated from what the state was saying. They wanted to make it stricter. So the state was giving you guidelines, and then the city or town was turning around and telling you something different. So people were really struggling with, okay, how do I deal with this? I lost, so a lot of my business is education for construction companies, and I would do it quarterly. I would do March, June, September, December. This hit early March, and my whole month that I had scheduled of education just evaporated. So it was very much going back to your mindset point is, okay, I had to kind of assume the mindset of like, okay, how can I be better when this is done? Or how can this be something good for my business? So I started writing, researching first, because regulatory space was where I kind of live, right? And what I kind of understood, because it was a combination of, it wasn't code per se, but it was regulation and it was permitting, because you needed to get permission from the building department to say, yes, you can go back to work, right? So
How did that work, John? Or how did, when you talk about the permission side of things, what did the company have to do to actually go and get that permission?
So what it eventually boiled down to is you needed to submit a COVID site-specific safety plan to the city or town to say, this is how we are going to protect our workers, okay? Where the problem came in was construction companies were getting differing information from different municipalities, be it the local city or town or the state, right? And then they also wanted to make sure they were complying with the CDC and the federal government. So I ended up writing a piece, how to write a construction fire safety plan, excuse me, a COVID site specific safety plan. And I put it on my website and I said, this is how you do it. And what I did was I researched all the different things and I said, okay, everybody wants something different, but if I just incorporate it all, it'll be a one size fits all no matter what town you're in, right? So by writing that article, and then people were reaching out saying, can you talk about this on the podcast? So I brought in 3 safety and risk managers from construction companies and said, how are you managing this on your site? So we had a roundtable discussion. And then as a result, the city of Boston Economic Development heard about it and said, hey, we have small business owners that don't know how to do this. Can you come help do training for them? So I did webinars for them. And then the building department saw that and said, hey, the contractors that are dealing with us, will you do education for them and do it with one of our building officials? That's where the city of Boston was great. They said, we're going to put you with a building inspector and talk together about what do they want to see as a building inspector when you do come to Boston, and what do you, Joe, know about all the regulations that they need to put in place, whether Boston's asking or not. How do we do this safely? And then a trade association reached out about the same topic. Other companies reached out asking for training and helping with their plans. So
it sounds like the industry, I mean, the authorities were very proactive in trying to get information out to contractors. I mean, I suppose having hindsight is always a great thing, but I suppose what, in your opinion, then did they do well, and what maybe could they have done a bit better?
From a
reaction to the whole situation.
Yeah. So like, how did the cities and towns react,
Yeah.
or how did
you talk about the state governments and then your the authorities within it, like your industry authorities. I mean, it sounds like they engage with you pretty quickly.
Yes. I would say that if you asked a lot of people, there was a tremendous amount of frustration. They said, too many people are telling us different things, and every week the rules are changing, right? So when you ask most folks, I think they would have the impression that it was chaotic and not very smooth, right? But in reality, when you dug in, there was absolutely no playbook for what was going on. And I think they actually did, considering the circumstances, they did a great job. And I look at, so locally here, Boston has what they call inspectional services, and that handles building inspectors. It handles housing inspectors that will do like apartment inspections. It has health inspectors that will inspect restaurants and things. They also issue certificates for daycare, schools, summer camps, right? The restaurants wanted to try and have outdoor seating, so you had to bring in the transportation department and public works. So everyone was just looking at the construction piece and saying, why don't they have their house in order and just tell us what they need? Well, they were trying to manage, schools that wanted to open, daycares that wanted to open, restaurants that were going to go out of business, construction sites that needed to get up and running. And it was really challenging for them. So yes, it seemed rough, but in reality, they did a pretty darn good job. To just be able to get something a month later up and running was actually pretty good execution. Yeah. I mean, I think I have a little bit of a libertarian streak in me, so I'm the first one to say, "Oh, government's a mess and they screw everything up." But in this case, they were starting from zero and
Yeah,
trying to figure this out, and there was no expert you could call,
yeah,
right?
that's right.
So I think they did a good job, and I think the general contractors and construction managers did a good job as well responding. And in some cases, there was a lot of working together where there was conversations between subcontractors, general contractors, municipalities to really try and work through this and do it right. So in the
Yeah,
end, I think it was well executed considering the circumstances.
seems to be that like the guidelines that have been recommended are there's a ton of common sense that needs to be applied.
Mm.
To keep just to keep people safe, and once it is applied, you know, we can only do our best. No one really knows what's coming next of this. I mean, where we are, a lot of talk about this, the second wave and all that type of stuff, and we don't know how lockdowns are going to work in the future. We're told to expect something, but how is it going to be full lockdown? Very target location based. We just don't know. But I think people, my opinion is as well, is people have starting, as you said, there was no playbook to this, so people just had to build this plane as it was taking off the runway and try and figure it out as we were going along. What's been the effects then on your own business? You touched on, you obviously it was a pretty busy period for you then. With there was a lot of people needed help. What do you think the long term effect of this will be on the business?
I think it got me to to move and be a little more nimble, to use an overused term, right? Um, there was a couple of additional business lines that I brought on, things that I had held off doing in the past because I wanted to try and just stay somewhat focused, but being candid, just out of fear, you know, just, hey, I've got a 5-year-old and a mortgage, and like, I need to make sure I can pay the bills. I started, um, probably taking a little bit too much on almost, and saying, okay, if you were asking me to come cut your lawn, I'd say yes at that point, right? Because I just didn't know what was going to happen. So it caused me to really open up to what I was willing to do. And yes, I probably opened up too much, but with opening big like that, there were some business lines that did make sense that I started to do. So it really changed my business. There's new things that I do now. Um, I realize that I can do more education remotely. Okay, I don't want to do it entirely remotely, but I can do it more remotely. So, um, I was able to tact, and it changed business. It got really busy, but in the end, I think I've come out better on the other side.
You touched on one of them, is the marketing and the branding side of is that one of the new sort of services that you think you might go with in the future?
Yes, I have. I'd had a lot of people ask, um, and I finally now have just taken on one client. I want to make sure that it works well and I have a good system, and um, it's productive and works for them. And if it does, then I'd consider taking on additional clients. There's a few other people that have expressed interest. So um, I think it might go there, but I didn't want to take on too much and not be able to bring the value to
Yeah,
the clients. So I think that's, I'm sure you probably feel the same way. Like, if you're not bringing value, if your software doesn't provide value to that end user, then you're lost. So you're almost better of over indexing on making sure the small group of people are really getting what they need. And then once you have that locked down, okay, then start to make it scalable. Kind of
mm.
how I think about it.
How much involvement would you have with softwares and construction technology in your day to day?
So it's funny. A lot of people lump me into, the technology side of things, where really I'm not strong on technology, but I think a better way to phrase it would be innovation. I'm really interested in innovation. Behind me, I have Pillar Technologies, these sensors that go on construction sites, right? And they measure humidity, temperature, smoke, dust particulate, all kinds of stuff. So I like the stuff that's out there, but I think it's more about innovation, because it could be something like mass timber, right? Where it's a product or a process, or it could be tech, right? Tech is part of that. But I'm kind of a firm believer that construction has I'm not saying anything earth shattering here. Construction has been behind the curve when it comes to innovation, technology, productivity. We're just not there. We're a laggard. There's a great little chart that was floating around that just showed how horrible construction was related to every other industry. I'll actually, I'll share it on my Instagram if people want to look at it. And it was really good because it talked about adoption on one axis and growth on the other. And you could just see how they were, low on the adoption and just really ended up being low on the growth as well because of it. So a lot of what I talk about is, innovation and, really pushing construction companies to understand that they have to innovate or they are going to be left behind. I mean, that gentleman you had on, was it Mark Mitchell or Mike Mitchell?
Yeah, Mark, yeah.
Yeah, where, when he talked about, potentially of Amazon buying Lowe's,
Yeah.
right? And really disrupting the construction materials market. I mean, if people think that's not going to happen, it doesn't have to be that particular thing, but if they think that we are immune as an industry, they're just so mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming our way. Things are going to change drastically, whether it's prefabrication and modular. I mean, the amount of companies I now see that have prefabrication managers, that wasn't a job before,
Mm-hmm.
right? And these are drywall companies, electricians. Everyone thinks of a drywall company, or maybe you guys just call it plasterers over there, and you don't think of innovation and prefabrication. But, there are drywall companies with full-time prefabrication managers. And there's another local company, Skender. There are, 80-something-year-old general contractor, just an old-fashioned GC builder. And they now have not only Skender Construction, they have Skender Manufacturing. And they're manufacturing modular units. And you can go to them. If you want something stick built, they'll stick build it. If you want something full modular, they'll do full modular. If you want a hybrid, they'll give you that hybrid. But I really think those are the companies that are going to win, right?
Yeah, the level of R&D that them companies would have had to do just to do that is impressive. Like, the ones that, like, we've seen even at a lower level, we've seen companies, and when I say lower level, I say respectively, and I say it in just in terms of turnover. We've seen companies like turning over 15, 20, 30 million that are now putting people in charge of technology. So at that level of turnover, they're saying we need a resource in here that can just manage technology and understand what's new, what's coming, and make sure we're on the ball. That's really interesting to me that's happening now. And it's, companies that don't look at that are suddenly going to be left behind, which is hugely interesting.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think it's got to be somewhat scary, especially for the smaller folks, the rapid pace of change. Like I said, I'm in the regulatory world, so I see people struggling with keeping up with the regulatory changes. You're in the tech space, you're seeing them struggle to keep up with the tech. Communication with employees, that goes back, a lot of people think of marketing just as about communicating with your customers, but it's also about communicating with your employees and them having a relationship and them contributing and now being part of the team, where it's not just marketing anymore. Your project manager could be your best marketer because they write great content on LinkedIn, or I've seen one super at Shawmut Construction, which is a big local company here, and he does a great job on Instagram, creating Instagram accounts for particular projects that people follow. And, that's just, so atypical to what people are used to
Mm-hmm.
that they really start to get uncomfortable. But the companies that are embracing that are really becoming successful. And
Yeah.
it's funny, people that listen to my podcast would probably heard me say this far too many times, but I usually will have construction company owners start to ask me about what I'm doing with LinkedIn. They're like, "Oh, we see you. What are you doing? Why are you doing that?" They don't necessarily understand, and I really stress to them that they should be using social media as a tool. And their initial response is always, "Well, I don't need more business. I have too much business." Right? And I'll usually ask them, I'll say, "Well, what are your problems?" They say, "Well, I can't find good people," you know? And then I'll say, "Okay, well, if I want to go work there, probably the first thing I'm going to do, or if I'm looking for a job and you reach out to me, the first thing I'm going to do is go look at your website and your social media and say, what's it like to work there?" Because I know if I go to Commodore Builders, they are type A,
Yeah.
like they're doing the tough mutters and, like you can really get a sense, right? So, and
It,
that's part of this.
it's just
Go ahead.
it's brand and culture, isn't it? Like you have an opportunity to just show people who you are, what you stand for. You could display your values. I've had this conversation so many times with companies saying, we're having a look at what you do marketing wise, but that would never work for me because I know I don't do tech, and I can't create content the way you create content because I wouldn't know what to talk about. And I'm saying, what the hell are you talking about? Just document what you're doing on the site. That's what people will want to see. Document who's on the site, the type of work you're doing, types of materials you're using. Like it's easy. That's actually
Oh,
easier than what we've got to do. But yeah, I'm with you there. Like you might not need to generate leads and have all that type of stuff going on with your marketing, but like branding and culture matters, and I think it matters even more in this generation than it ever did.
so much more. And you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I bet you if you and I sat in a room, we could whip off 500 things for content. It's as simple as, wow, there's this new anchor bolt that I've never seen on a project before. Why can't you take a picture of that ankle bolt and say, hey, look at how they designed this thing, blah, blah, blah. And now you have hundreds of people that are interested in anchor bolts, which would be someone that might want to work with you or work for you, following you and saying, wow, look at what they're doing, right?
I've got to send them back to your essential craftsman on YouTube, and you say he's got what 500K followers, something like that.
Yeah,
What sort of content he's putting out? Probably documenting different types of work.
absolutely. That's what he's doing. And the fact that he's a 60-something-year-old YouTuber, just it's hard to throw your mind around. You don't when someone says, "Oh, there's this 10-year-old YouTuber success," you're like, "Okay, that's kind of impressive, but not surprising, right?" But when it's an old guy that's been building houses for his entire life, and not really that old, right? But still, to go from being a home builder to
Yeah,
a full-time YouTuber in his 60s is crazy. And I would say even further, like the people that say I have enough work, well, it could be what type of work do you have, right? Wouldn't you like to have a better choice? Or even let's say you have employees that want to work on certain type of projects, want to stretch themselves and grow. If social media is a way for you to get a more interesting project to work on that would fulfill the needs of your employees, that would be great. I mean, I spoke to one CEO and we were talking about growth because he went from 40 million to 400 million, in 5 years maybe, right? And I didn't get a vibe from him that he was about conquering the world. That just wasn't who he is. And I asked myself, why are you growing? I don't imagine you sit there at the beginning of the year and say, we want to grow 30% this year. What's your thought? Like, why are you growing so aggressively? How are you growing so aggressively? And his answer was, he said, listen, he goes, if I hire Kieran to be a project manager, right? And he wants to be a senior project manager or a project exec. But I say, you know what? We have 5 senior PMs and execs, and there's no place for you to go. You're going to be a PM for the next 15 years, right? He says, that person's going to leave. He goes, we need to grow in order to give the people that work for us opportunities to grow. And it was just, I had never thought of it that way. And I was like, wow, what a great way to think of it. So it wasn't about making more money. That might be a nice byproduct of it, right? But at the end of the day, it was about giving the people that work for him opportunities. And the reason I had him on originally is he had such a great learning and development program at his company. It was just off the charts where they, if you're a super or whoever, you're getting going 2-day public speaking classes to really learn how to speak and write. They have like a book club where you can the company will buy any book you want for you. They have like an Audible account. Everybody gets it. They have a Headspace, the meditation app. You ever hear of it,
Yeah,
Headspace?
yeah.
They have a corporate membership for that. So anybody can get it. If you want to learn and grow and meditate and get better, they'll buy you a book. They'll give you the app to meditate. They'll teach you. So it's really about helping your employees grow. And he realizes that if his employees grow, he's going to grow and he's going to be successful.
Yeah, it's probably a leaf from the Richard Branson book. I remember reading that his senior management question and raising the question, what if we train them and they leave? And Branson's response was, well, what if we don't and they stay?
Yeah, there's so much truth to that, what you're saying.
Joe, you've been very, very kind with your time. Where can our listeners find out more about your podcast, about you and your company, I suppose?
Sure. It's the Mass Construction Show. It's on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, pretty much all the platforms. Joseph Kelly on LinkedIn. I probably use LinkedIn for the straight business stuff. Instagram, Mass Construction. It's a little more personal.
So you're on Stitcher, the Mass Construction Show. You're on iTunes, anywhere. You're on Spotify.
Yep, Spotify.
Yeah, Spotify. Yep. So all the usuals, and then the website
is massconstruction.org.
And Joseph Kelly on LinkedIn.
Yep.
Joe, we really thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I appreciate everything you're doing. I think your content you're putting out is adding to the construction community. I think it's great.
We appreciate that, Joe. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.